Hello and welcome to Glasgow Doors Open Day's Digital Festival. This event will begin soon, but first we have a brief housekeeping message. So that you can get the most out of this session, we'd like to point out a few features of Zoom. By clicking on the buttons at the bottom of the Zoom window, you will be able to access the chat room, and if you are in a webinar, you will also be able to make use of the Q&A function. The Q&A function is so that you can ask specific questions of the speaker, which they will be able to answer time allowing at the end of the session. Use the chat room to contribute more generally to the discussion or to share links and resources. When using these features, please mind your P's and Q's. Both will be monitored and recorded. Most sessions will be recorded and uploaded to Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival YouTube channel and website. If you're in a meeting, please make sure you keep your microphone on mute unless otherwise directed by the host. If for some reason the session ends unexpectedly or you lose connection, please just click the link again and wait to be let back in. Similarly, if the host loses connection, please bear with us. We will do our best to manage any connection issues as and when they occur, and may contact you by email if necessary. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'd love to hear about your experience of our digital festival. Fill out our survey to be in with a chance of winning a prize. Our survey is available at www.glasgowdoorsopendayfestival.org.uk/survey. We hope you enjoy this event.
Hello. This is Norry Wilson from Lost Glasgow, speaking to you from the bright lights of downtown Cardonald. And it's a very different Doors Open Day this year to the one that we had planned. One where I don't get to see the whites of your eyes, or hang about after the talk to glether with you, or retire for a well-earned pint or two. The thing is, when I planned this talk, which feels like a good few months back, and decided to centre it around visitors to Glasgow, I didn't realise, none of us realised, that this summer would be a summer of no visitors to Glasgow due to the COVID crisis. So tonight we're going to look back. We're going to meet some of the famous faces who have visited our city, who they were, why they came, and then I'll focus on a few particular visitors who left an indelible mark in Glasgow. Because if all the world's a stage, then Glasgow's streets are our boards, and its architecture our stage backdrop. And whether you have a starring role or just a walk-on part, all our dramas, all our lives are played out against the backdrop of Glasgow. Now, I'm going to go full screen, hopefully, and we will start the fun and games. Bear with me for a second. Just need to make sure that I'm pressing the right buttons. Here we go. So, put the kettle on, plump up the cushions, get your good china out. We're going to get some visitors. And from the earliest days of the city, they all came. We've welcomed saints. Here's Smug's wonderful St Mungo mural at the top of the High Street, illustrating the legend of the bird who never flew. I love this modern update of our patron saint, and it's certainly become one of the most popular features in the Glasgow mural walk. We welcomed Romans. Okay, so not these Romans. This was Chipperfield's circus parade passing through Glasgow Cross in the 1950s. The real Romans were wall building just north of the city and freezing their togas on a River Point lookout high above York Hill. We even welcomed heffalumps to Glasgow. Here they are passing through Gorbals Cross in 1952. I think that's what you call a trunk road. And again, these wonderful animals, they disembarked at the old college college goods yards in the high street and were making their way right through the city, right out through to Queen's Park Recreation Ground where the circus was to take part. But these weren't the first elephants to arrive in Glasgow. Incredibly, Glasgow got its first glimpse of a bonny elephant in 1681. In his Memorialis, the Presbyterian minister, Robert Law, recorded the wonder of seeing a bonny elephant in the Trongate, where it was paraded and performed tricks. Now, as an animal lover, and particular lover of elephants, I can't really approve of that, but I'll return to elephants later in this tale, because they've got another part to play in Glasgow's story. And why did they come to Glasgow? Because it was, and I think still is, although I might be a wee bit biased, one of the world's great cities. I love this panorama of the city. It was done in the 1860s by putting an artist up in a hot air balloon so that he could look right out across the city. And we've welcomed all sorts. We've welcomed great authors, such as the French fantasy author Jules Verne. He came to Glasgow in the 1860s to study our world-leading shipbuilding and engineering prowess. Incredibly, at the same time, he went up to visit Loch Katrine, and inspired by the scheme to bring fresh water to the city, he even wrote a novella, The Underground City, set beneath the waters of the Loch. Verne wasn't finished with Glasgow. He also featured Glasgow-built steamers, then the fastest in the world, in his US Civil War adventure, the Blockade Runners. We've also welcomed any number of big showbiz stars. Here's Danny Kaye clowning about at Hampden ahead of the 1950 Scottish Charities Cup final, which, needless to say, was a Celtic Rangers affair. And if any of you care about it, and I know some folk in Glasgow still do, Celtic had the bragging rights that day, running out 3-2 winners. But Danny Kaye, who was performing at the Glasgow Empire that week, he was out with the bands before the game. I think he may even have been involved in tossing the coin to see who went to which end, but he certainly kept the crowds entertained. One thing we forget, one of the reasons why so many of the great US stars came to Glasgow, it was the fact it gave them easy access to some of the best golf courses in the world. If they were doing 2 shows a night at the Empire, well, if they got up early, headed out just after breakfast, they could be down in Ayrshire, down playing at Troon or Gales, or even up to up north and get a game of golf in the day before they did their show. Other folk came. Here's the wonderful Paul Robeson, who led the 1960 May Day parade in Glasgow to Queen's Park, where he serenaded the crowd with Old Man River. What other song could he sing in Glasgow? And that wasn't his first visit to Glasgow. When he came to the city in 1938 to perform at the Empire exhibition in Bellahouston Park, Robeson, a noted socialist, took time to vanish for a wee while. What was he doing? He was performing at a one-off fundraiser to help raise funds for the Spanish Civil War for the Republican side. And thousands of Glaswegians turned out to donate foods and money to help the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War and listen to Robeson sing his songs. And if you want to sing in the rain, who better to come to Glasgow than Gene Kelly? He dropped into Scotland in 1953. This is him just in Gordon Street outside Central Station, supposedly to scout locations for his forthcoming film, Brigadoon. In reality, he and producer Arthur Freed were actually having a wee jolly at the film studio's expense. But the pair got about a bit. They visited Burns Cottage, played around the golf at Turnberry, but they took one look at the Scottish weather and, needless to say, went back to Hollywood and shot the whole film on a Hollywood back lot. And if we're talking about overseas escapes, here's the world's greatest escapologist, Harry Houdini, who performed at Glasgow's Pavilion Theatre in 1920. Excuse me. That box you see at the back, that was made by the joiners of the Clyde Yards, who had bet Houdini that he couldn't escape a box, a Clyde-built manufactured box. and they laid a wage that he wouldn't take up the challenge. But he did. The box was hauled onto the stage at the pavilion, and sure enough, in a few minutes, Houdini had somehow managed to make his way out of it. There's one great story about Harry Houdini, apocryphal, I'm sure, that when he performed at the pavilion, he managed to get himself locked in the gents' lavies and had to be rescued. I suspect that is just Glasgow myth-making. Another great star, who was a semi-regular visitor to Glasgow, was Cary Grant. Here he is in the Central Hotel, just about to vanish upstairs in the lift. Now, Cary might look all suave and sophisticated here, but when he first performed in Glasgow, he was rolling about the stage in his vest and pants as part of a tumbling act at the old Panopticon Music Hall, the Pots and Pans in Trongate. Someone else with a very strong link to the Panopticon is, of course, Stan Laurel, who grew up on the south side of the city, while his father managed the old Scotia Music Hall in the Salt Market. Stan made his stage debut at the Panopticon, aged just 16, wearing his father's best jacket, which he'd borrowed for the occasion without telling his dad. And when his dad heard that his boy was making a fool of himself on the stage at the Panopticon, he rushed round to see what was happening. And when Stan saw his dad in the audience, he tried to run off stage, only to catch his dad's good long coat on one of the footlights and tear it straight up the back. And that got the biggest laugh of the night. So when Laurel and Hardy came to Glasgow in 1948, apart from putting on a show in the city, where Oliver Hardy, who was such a girth, they had to stitch 2 kilts together to go round him, they also took a wee drive up to Straven to welcome meet their old show business mate, Sir Harry Lauder at Lauder Hall. Great scientists came too. Here's Albert Einstein in 1933 with Professor Archie Young up at Glasgow University. Einstein was in Glasgow to accept an honorary degree from the university. And I think Mrs. Young has put both him and her husband outside the house to smoke. I don't care if he is the smartest physicist in the world, he's no smoking that pipe in our good room. So the 2 bold boys were punted out onto the doorstep to have a smoke. Other exotic visitors. Now, you might not recognise the chap in the middle here. You might not recognise the chaps either side. But the guy in the middle is the Polish-born author Joseph Conrad, author of Heart of Darkness. The chap on the left is Captain David Bone, a Glasgow seaman. And the chap on the right is his brother, the artist Muirhead Bone, Britain's first official war artist. Now, Conrad and David Bone, they were old seafaring mates. And looking at their faces there, I think they both might be a wee bit hungover. Because this was Conrad sailing from the Clyde to America for his first ever visit. And the night before, he'd been out on the Lash in Glasgow. Neil Munro, the author of the Parahandy stories, had thrown a dinner in Conrad's honour at the old North British Hotel. And about 11 o'clock at night, he'd said to Conrad, "Do you want to become an honorary Glaswegian?" And the entire dinner party in their dicky bows and tailcoats had trooped out into George Square, where they'd tried to throw chuckies into the top hat of the James Cowan statue. Needless to say, even back in those days, that raised eyebrows, and a couple of big police stopped them and said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" And they explained themselves, and the police said, "Away back to your dinner, dinna make fools of yourselves." Roll on till about 2 years ago, and I'm doing a guided walking tour around George Square, and I always take a bag of chuckies with me. And we got to the James Cowan statue, and I told the story, and then invited the 20 or 30 people that were with me to have a go at throwing chuckies into the top hat. Needless to say, we had a queue of folk doing this when 2 big motorcycle cops pulled up, and I thought, oh God, here we go. And they came over and said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" And again, I told the story. The 2 big cops looked about, took their helmets off, and asked if they could have a shot. And needless to say, one of them scored a hat trick. Three chuckies in a row, straight into the top hat. Other famous faces. Frank Sinatra, old Blue Eyes himself, who performed to actually fairly lacklustre crowds at the Glasgow Empire in 1957. His bobby socks career was over and his film career was yet to begin, and he was at a pretty low ebb in his life. Mind you, Frank had met Glasgow boys before. Here's our very own Ricky Fulton with Frank. Frank and Ricky duetted together when Fulton presented the BBC's showband show in the Light programme in the 1950s. It was only when I shared this picture a couple of months ago in Lost Glasgow, an old fella at the BBC pointed out to me, the wee guy sitting on the right in the white pullover, that's Johnny Stewart, and he was the radio show's producer. Somehow he'd remarkably persuaded Frank Sinatra to appear on BBC Radio for the princely sum of just £50. Some of you, if you're pop music fans, will know Johnny Stewart better as the original producer of Jukebox Jury and the inventor and producer of Top of the Pops. So, after that wee whirlwind tour of some of the famous faces who have visited Glasgow, let's take a look at some of the really famous visitors and what brought them here. In 1939, tragedy brought a young American student to Glasgow, the future US President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. In September 1939, this Glasgow-built ship was torpedoed by Germans on the opening day of World War II. Joe Kennedy, who was the US ambassador to the UK, sent his young son north to reassure those affected by the disaster that would be safely transported back to the US and to gather first-hand information as to the actual circumstances of the attack. The ship had sailed from Liverpool and was carrying a whole mixture of Canadians and Americans going home to avoid the war. And just off Ireland, they were sunk. And the majority of those that were rescued were brought back first to Ireland and then back to the Clyde. JFK arrived in Prestwick Airport on Thursday the 7th of September and caught the train up to Glasgow, where he was welcomed at Glasgow Central Station by the Lord Provost of Glasgow, Patrick Dolan, that's him on the left. Patrick Dolan, of course, who would later go on to give his names to the wonderful swimming pool at East Kilbride, the Dolan Baths. Here they are going into the city chambers together. Together, the pair visited around 150 survivors in hospital and at the two local hotels where they had been put up. The Beresford here in Sauchiehall Street, which had been built and was brand new, pretty well, it had been built for the 1930 Empire exhibition. Other survivors were put up here at the Adelphi Hotel on the corner of Union Street and Argyle Street, which most of you, of course, will know as Dizzy Corner, because Boots, which used to just be on the bottom floor, eventually took over the whole of the hotel building and become the big Boots that so many of us knew growing up. And the day proved to have an impact on the future politician. He gave one of his first ever public speeches in Glasgow. Here's what he had to say. I have never seen people more grateful for all that has been done for them by Glasgow than those whom I have spoken to today. The landlord Provost Dolan organised a warm welcome for the Athenia survivors. He even launched a special relief fund for them, with the people of Glasgow contributing more than £3,500 to supply them with the necessaries. You've got to remember these folk had lost everything and arrived in the city pretty well in the clothes that they stood up in. Kennedy added, I have told Lord Provost Dolan that it is the desire of the American government to undertake complete responsibility for the care of our nationals. But he has insisted that Glasgow regards it as a privilege to undertake this responsibility. That is a very generous gesture indeed, and it will be fully appreciated by my countrymen. I will go back and tell my father how kind you have been to our people. One survivor, American teacher Mildred Finlay, later recalled, one day we went to the Lord Provost's reception. He threw a big tea party for the survivors in the City Hall the city chambers. I could hardly believe that all those people could have been on that one ship at sea and all saved through little lifeboats. We were highly entertained with speeches, a bagpipe outfit, and even Harry Lauder. Harry sang all the old songs he used to sing in America, and then many that his Scottish audience called for. The city of Glasgow certainly did all it could to make our stay a pleasant one. Finally, on Tuesday, September 19th, we went into Glasgow to sail for home on the Orizaba. And as we proceeded down the river, the clouds broke and the sun came out. Since it was about 5 o'clock, the shifts were just changing in the shipyards. And for the first 5 miles, the river was lined with a continuous group of cheering men, all of them wishing us safe passage and good luck. We were quite touched and shouted back goodbyes and cries of good luck to them. They needed it seemingly more than we did. Now, from one tragedy to both a triumph and a tragedy. Rock and roll pioneer Eddie Cochrane's one and only visit to Glasgow in February 1960. He would die just 2 months later in a taxi crash in Chippenham in Wiltshire on his way to London Airport to fly back to the States. He was just 21 at the time. Here's Eddie backstage at the Glasgow Empire with his trademark Gretsch guitar, where he paid a 1-week residency with fellow American rocker Gene Vincent. And Gene Vincent dressed for the occasion. Here he is in a pair of tartan trews backstage at the Glasgow Empire. Now, and I know I've got the Glasgow bug bad when I look at the music, the score music to Eddie's Summertime Blues, and then I recognise the Glasgow Empire wallpaper behind him. And that guitar that Eddie's playing, it carries some story as well. You see, after Eddie's final London gig, it was carried to his waiting taxi by a young chap, a young aspiring musician called Mark Feld, later to change his name to Mark Bolan and to form T-Rex. And following the crash that killed Eddie, and before the inquest into his death, the guitar was stored at the local police station in Chippenham. There, a young police cadet called David Harmon taught himself how to play on Eddie's guitar. He later changed his name to Dave D, and along with his pals Dozy, Beaky, Mick and Titch, found fame with his own pop group. I'm indebted to Glasgow snapper and rock and roll fan Rob McLeod for these unique backstage images. He worked for British Rail at the time of these visits and persuaded his bosses at British Rail, well, if these stars are staying at the Central Hotel, I should go and interview them in the Glasgow theatres where they were performing. But Glasgow's also welcomed other exotic visitors. In November 1918, just after the end of the First World War, we rolled out the red carpet for Emir Faisal of Iraq and Lawrence of Arabia. That's Lawrence on the right there, playing little to Faisal's large. Ahead of the Paris peace talks, the pair visited the North British Locomotive Works in Springburn, probably to look at the very kinds of trains that the pair of them had been busy blowing up during the First World War campaign against the Turks. This is them at the old Springburn Locomotive Works, which later became part of Springburn College and North Glasgow College. Of course, they visited all the highlights. They visited Beardmuirs, they visited Dalmuir and Clydebank, all the major tourist spots you would on any visit to Scotland. In reality, it was actually a bit of a dirty trick to allow the UK, France and America to carve up the Middle East and its oil riches under the Sykes-Picot Agreement, while this pair were out the country, literally lines drawn in the sand, some of which are still causing problems to this day. In 1936, it was the turn of Glasgow to welcome an emperor, Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. That's him on the left of the picture, just coming out of the city chambers. Go online and you'll be able to find this whole path newsreel. It's only about 5 minutes long, where Poor Haile Selassie obviously gets a visible fright when he steps off the train at Glasgow Central and somebody starts playing the bagpipes. He was in Scotland to holiday with his friend Lord Inverclyde down at Wemyss Bay. They weren't on a caravan site, but staying at Lord Wemyss Inverclyde Gaff, the now demolished Wemyss Castle, which they sailed to by private steamer from the centre of Glasgow. The visit was also a first for the Scottish press, with the Daily Record claiming the world's first colour newspaper photograph, a first for not just the Scottish press, but the world press. We're back down on the Clyde side to welcome our next guest, folk singer Woody Guthrie. That's him far right in the Clutha mural, alongside Mary Barber of Rent Strike fame, the boxer Benny Lynch, and the hero safecracker Johnny Remensky. Now, I'd long heard rumours that Woody had visited and played in Glasgow, but it took another couple of musicians to confirm this story for me. Reading a memoir by Hamish Imlach, seen here, keeking out the wall with a Clutha, he recalled a story from the early 1960s when he ran the Glasgow Folk Club. On the bill that night was Woody's former sideman and shipmate, Cisco Houston. In the run-up to D-Day, Woody and Cisco's ship had been torpedoed, and the pair were brought ashore in Liverpool. Keen to explore their Scottish roots, Guthrie and Houston hightailed it north to Glasgow. And this is where the story sort of went dead for a while, until Hamish picked up the tale. When Cisco returned to Glasgow in the early 1960s, he asked Hamish to take him to one pub, the notorious Betty's Bar on Lansfield Quay down at the Brimilaw. Cisco walked in and said it hadn't changed much since he'd last been in the 1940s. The thing about Betty's Bar is it was known to seamen from around the world. Let's just say it had a bit of a reputation. The ladies of the night used to gather there to pick up sailors, and rumour has it that they would chalk their prices on the soles of their shoes and then sit opposite their mark and cross their legs so that the seamen could see their price on the sole of the shoe. Whether the prices went up or went down over the course of the night, I've never quite found out. Now, I said earlier that we'd be going back to elephants. And this final tale is one that involves elephants, cowboys, and Native Americans. Over Christmas and New Year in 1891-92, legendary showman Buffalo Bill brought his Wild West show to Glasgow, Denison to be exact, the old East End showground. With him was the famous female sharpshooter, Annie Oakley, who had this wonderful red and white silk tartan taffeta dress made up for her Scottish visit. She also took time out to have this picture taken in Jamaica Street. At Christmas that year, she sent thousands of signed copies of this picture as a Christmas card to all her fans around the world, making the first celebrity photographic Christmas card ever in the world. While in Glasgow, a grand dinner was thrown for our American visitors at the Grand Hotel at Charing Cross, later to fall victim to the building of the M8. There, after the meal and the speeches were over, Buffalo Bill led all his Glasgow guests down the stairs into the main hall, where the Native Americans did war dances and sang hymns in their native Sioux for their hosts. The remarkable thing was they set up their tents and teepees down by the tenements in Denison, and their presence caused quite a stir. There was a kids' street song at the time, one that I've later discovered was sung in the Girl Guides and the Brownies right through to the 1950s. I'm not going to try and sing it because I've got no singing voice, but here we go. Dressed in Indian feathers, listen to me talking Indian blethers, with my squaw and my wee papoose, a wigwam's better than a council house. When I start pow-wowing, everybody wonders what I'm chowing. Ricky, Ricky do, I'm a redskin now, I'm a regular Okie chief. But what's even more remarkable about this visit is the fact that it was such a big event, but it's so poorly recorded in the photographic record of Glasgow. But there's great stories that go with the visit, particularly this first visit. Among the one of the performers was this fella, a young Lakota Sioux called Charging Thunder, who'd been imprisoned in America after the ghost dance cult led to the massacre at Wounded Knee. Buffalo Bill had to approach the American authorities to parole Charging Thunder and numerous other of the well-known Lakota Sioux warriors so that they could join him on his tour of Europe. Sure enough, the government was glad to see the back of them and paroled them to Buffalo Bill to take them away to Europe. Now, sadly, on Hogmanay, 1891, Charging Thunder rather blotted his copybook. What else would most folk do if they were far from home on Hogmanay? He got pissed in the Gallowgate and attacked the show's translator. This is George Krieger, the guy who he attacked. Now, George, it was suggested, had been flogging off sacred ghost dance shirts to museums the length and breadth of Britain. We know that Kelvin Grove used to have a ghost dance shirt and other ghost dance mementos because when the Lakota Sioux asked for them back, Glasgow graciously gave them back and the Sioux gave us replica items in their place. But the suggestion is that Charging Thunder knew what Krieger was up to, selling off sacred items for a few bucks. So when he came back from drinking in the Gallowgate, he thumped Krieger over the head with a war stick and got hauled off here, the old Tobago Street police station. Needless to say, in good Glasgow form, Charging Thunder maintained that his lemonade must have been spiked with whiskey. And no, Your Honour, I can't remember what pub I was in. After a few days in here, when the courts reopened at the start of the new year, he was sentenced to 30 days in the big house, the Bar L. And don't worry, those figures in the foreground aren't escaping prisoners. They're tatty boggles, keeping the crows off the crops of the old prison farm. But that's not where our story ends. When Buffalo Bill brought his Wild West show back to Europe in 1903, this time he wasn't performing in Denniston. He was performing at the old 3rd Lanarkshire Rifles parade ground over near Queen's Park in Govan Hill, a bit called Baw Park. And Charging Thunder had regained the show, only this time he fell in love with Josephine, one of the show's female stunt riders. That's the happy couple sitting front and centre. And when the show moved on to Manchester, it caused quite a stir. Here's the entire Indian cast in a Manchester tram. You can just imagine a wee Manchester clippy saying, "Mon chief, move right up the car." Now, when they got to Manchester, Charging Thunder married his Josephine and they set up home in Salford. He changed his name to George Edward Williams and he worked for many years at Manchester's Bellevue Circus, where he looked after the elephants. Needless to say, his favourite elephant was called Nellie, and according to his family, when Charging Thunder would take too much to drink. At night, he would go to the circus, let himself into the zoo, and climb in with the elephants and sleep off his hangover with Nellie standing guard over of him, no doubt dreaming of the plains of his childhood, with his huge pachyderm pal keeping lookout for him. Charging Thunder died from pneumonia in 1929 at the age of 52 and is buried in Gorton Cemetery. But his descendants live on in Manchester. Imagine that, from the Great Plains of America to a reservation, to a prison in the States, to Glasgow, to a second prison, Berlin, to happy married life in Manchester with elephants for mates. That is one hell of a life story. But just as Glasgow goes rune and rune, like it says in the song, so does this story. And it brings us right back to Glasgow. A couple of years ago, after speaking about Buffalo Bill's visit to the Grand Hotel, I was approached by a retired architect who, as a student in 1968, had bought the Central Hotel's old revolving doors just before it was demolished. He sat on them for a few years until in the early 80s, late 70s, he was asked to help design Cafe Gandolfi in Albion Street. And he got the old doors out of his garage and he used them for the main doors of Cafe Gandolfi. The next time you push through those doors, imagine Buffalo Bill, Annie Oakley, and Charging Thunder doing the same. And as I say, the story of Buffalo Bill just continues. I was speaking about him online just a couple of weeks ago and was contacted by a Lost Glasgow follower, Maeve Dixon, who held out the tantalising prospect. She said, "Norry, I've got photographs of the 1904 visit to Glasgow, taken by my great uncle, Tom Lindsay, who was an artist and photographer in Glasgow, who was later to go on to be injured in the First World War. Maeve sent me the pictures. Not many folk have seen them. As I say, considering how important the visits of Buffalo Bill were to Glasgow, it's remarkable how little recorded they were in the photographic record. So if you go onto the Lost Glasgow site, you can click back a few posts and you'll find Tom's photographs of Buffalo Bill in Glasgow. Now, I'm looking at my time and realising that I have actually somewhat raced through this. That's the trouble with not having a live audience. I don't have you guys to bounce off. So if you've got any questions, I will try to answer them. My Lost Glasgow sidekick, Bill McIntosh, has been listening in all the way through this. And if you've been using the Q&A or the chat options, he'll have been picking up. And fingers crossed that when I go back to my own screen, you guys will be able to see both myself and Bill will be able to fire any questions back at me. So for just now, if you're just logging off and not hanging about, once again, thank you for being one of the estimated, I think, 460 folk that were tuning in tonight. And all I can say is next year, I hope to see you all again in person, when we'll all be able to go for a pint and a blether after the talk. And I hope you enjoy the rest of Doors Open Day week. There's some fabulous online events coming up. So please keep tuned to see what else is coming up. Thank you.
Norry, hi. Brilliant talk as usual. Can you hear me?
Hang on. I think so, yeah, I can hear you.
So we very early on got a question from Jenny H saying, why was the corner of Union Street and Argyle Street called Dizzy Corner? I thought it was called Boots Corner. Tell us.
It was called Boots. Well, It was called Boots Corner if you were going to Boots. It was a famous spot for youngsters to meet for a date. You'd say, meet me at 7:30 at Boots Corner. And then what you do is if you walked down and you saw your date hanging about, whether you were a girl or a boy, and you took a second look at them and you realised that you didn't really want to go out on a date with them, you'd just keep walking and leave them hanging about. You'd stand them up. So Dissy Corner stands for Disappointment Corner, for all the thousands of young ladies and young men who were left disappointed, hanging about for a date who never showed up at Dissy Corner.
Okay, thanks for that. Susan G's also typed in saying, what was the name of the ship that sank that brought JFK to Glasgow?
It was the Athenia.
Sorry, say again?
The Athenia. It was a Glasgow-built ship, but it was sailing from Liverpool to Canada, and as I say, just off the north coast of Ireland. It was torpedoed, literally within hours of war being declared, and the folk that were on board were obviously trying to skedaddle out of Britain before war was declared, and just got caught in that trap, so to speak. They'd set sail, and once they were away, war was declared. And I think I'm right in saying it was one of the first sinkings of the war.
Okay, thanks for that. Stephen has come into the Q&A and said, great talk, Norry. Are there any questions about Glasgow you've never been able to find an answer to in your research and think might be lost to history?
That's a difficult one. There's what you often get in Glasgow is someone will tell you a story and you think that's absolutely fascinating, and you go away and try and research it and you can't find any trace of it, and then you'll find a very, very slight kernel of the story, because as usual in Glasgow, because we love to tell stories, stories grow arms and legs over the years. And what may have been a very, very small incident, when it actually happened, by the time that your grannies talked about it and your grandpas talked about it, and they've handed the story down to your mum and dad, and then they tell you the story. As I say, what was originally a very minor incident has grown into a major incident, because everyone likes to add their own wee bit of colour, their own wee bit of drama to a story, so the stories get bigger than the telling. And sometimes when you go back and actually trace the actual event, the event was almost nothing to write home about, so to speak.
You okay, still there?
Yeah.
Okay. Gavin Mitchell says, cheers, Norry, that was smashing. I remember taking some mistletoe to Dizzy Corner. What a dream.
I suspect that is Gavin Mitchell, Bobby the barman.
Is that right?
Still game, if I'm right, my old pal Gavin. Mind you, he says,
sorry. Miriam says, great talk, poignant bit about charging thunder. Well done. A whole host of thank yous. I'll read them out for you if you want. Great talk. F. Linton says, great talk, thanks very much. Fiona Cairn-Smith, many thanks, much appreciated. Brian McKay, great talk, Norry, thank you very much for a great evening. Vicky Getty, thank you, I love these stories. Anne Irwin, ta much, Norry. Mick says, no questions, but thoroughly enjoyed that, so thank you very much. Jane, many thanks, brilliant presentation. City of Glasgow swim team says, great talk, thanks, Norry. Andrea Rossi, thank you very much, Norry, what an amazing talk. June Weston, great talk, thanks, Norry. Catherine, thanks very much for this fab talk. Billy Cowan, cheers, Norry, brilliant talk, thanks. Ken Monaghan, thanks, Norry. Margaret Reid, brilliant talk, you should do them every month, please. I'll watch this space.
Yeah.
Judith McAllister, thanks a lot, Norry, great job. Yagio, many thanks for your brilliant talk. As a new student here, I learned a lot. Karen, absolutely fabulous, Norry, can't thank you enough. Keep doing such a great service for Glasgow and local historians. Jenny H, great, thanks. Jeanette McGuinness, thanks, Norry, interesting as usual. Gus Smith, thanks, Norry, great stuff as ever. Jane Bailey, thank you. Heather Ayer, thanks, Norry, very interesting. Looking forward to visiting Glasgow soon. Kate, really enjoyed the presentation. Thanks, Norry. Yvonne McAlpine, thanks. Fiona Taylor, thanks, Norry. Loved the history and the photos. Thomas Arcambo, fascinating stuff. Thanks, Norry. Natalie says, thank you very much for this. Cannot wait for a live tour at some point. Susie says, fantastic presentation. John A, really enjoyable. I'll catch some more. Carmen Valerio, thank you. Brilliant stories. Leslie Adams, thank you. Love meeting the old photograph. Love seeing the old photos. Jim McFadgen, excellent presentation and talk. Thanks very much. Linda Bradford, thank you. Enjoyed the talk. Ian Nicholson, great talk, Norry. Very interesting to hear all the stories. Also great old photos. Henry, many thanks, Norry. Great stuff from our city's history. Buster's mum says, great talk, Norry. Very enjoyable. Thanks. And Susie says, George Wiley paid tribute to Springburn locomotives, etc., with his straw locomotive at Finnieston Crane.
Yeah, yeah. I remember being down at the Finnieston Crane when they set fire to it at the end of the Garden Festival. And I think I'm right in saying that when the new cruise terminal opens down in Greenock, part of it is to feature a huge retrospective of George Wiley's amazing and bewildering artworks. So I'll be looking forward to that when it eventually arrives.
Right, well, there are many, many more thank yous. Catherine says, what a chuckle, Trunk Road. Thanks for an informative talk and giving me a laugh. Maureen Kerrigan, loves the Lost Glasgow page and all the old photos. Great talk tonight. Could listen to stories of Glasgow all night. Dozens and dozens just simply saying thank you. Fiona Reid says, thanks, Norry. Was in Denison today looking at Buffalo Bill's statue. Miriam says, did Danny Kaye not serenade a Glasgow audience outside the Central Station Hotel?
He did indeed. The very last night of his engagement at the Glasgow Empire, the entire crowd out of the Glasgow Empire mobbed him outside the theatre. Almost stopped him getting into his limousine, which was taking him down to the Central Hotel. And then a crowd of about, well, however many the Glasgow Empire could hold, followed him down to the Central Hotel and stood at the corner of Hope Street and Gordon Street, shouting his name. And eventually, Danny came out onto the wee bit of balcony high up at the corner and sat with his legs overhanging the parapet and sang Balling the Jack, and had the entire crowd in the palm of his hand and the entire crowd singing along. Blocked the streets in both directions. He also went down to the Hillington Industrial Estate, where he got himself a pair of personally made to measure golf clubs, a set of golf clubs out of John Letters, which apparently he played with until his dying day. He said they were the finest golf clubs he'd ever had.
Good stuff. Susan G says, just think more attendees that could attend in person. Thank you, very interesting. Sarah Jane Moffat says, which visit was it that Buffalo Bill stayed in Paisley?
Now, I'm not sure. I'll need to have a look at the dates. I think it would probably be the 1904 visit. Somewhere I have seen the entire schedule for his 1904 visit, because he fairly got about. They were up in Aberdeen, they were in Dundee. You know, they went absolutely everywhere around Britain. I think I'm right in saying the 1904 crowds in Glasgow were the second biggest crowds they attracted anywhere in the world. And that includes playing in St. Petersburg in Russia, playing in Paris, Berlin. I think the crowd size in Glasgow was second only to the World's Fair in America. So that tells you how popular they were. And it also probably explains why practically every wee boy in Glasgow grew up wanting to be a cowboy.
Margaret Reid says, if you do these talks every month, have a vote for topics. Gus Smith says, did Danny Kaye present the trophy at the cup final? Do we know?
Did he? He may well have done. I'll need to have a look back and see if I can find a picture of him actually doing it. I've got a picture of him leading both teams out the tunnel. That picture of him clowning about with the pipe band, which I suspect would be the Glasgow Police Pipe Band. Whether I've actually got one of them with the trophy, but I suspect if he was there, he'd be the one that would be presenting the trophy, as he'd be the biggest star on the pitch, notwithstanding the Rangers and Celtic stars.
Bo Jana says, greetings from Sweden and amazing stories. Can't wait to go back to Glasgow.
Tusen tack to my friends in Sweden.
Maureen Kerrigan says, how many hotels were in Glasgow all those years ago? Seem to have lost all those amazing buildings.
The strange thing is, an awful lot of the buildings are still there, but they aren't hotels anymore. They've been converted into offices. That said, obviously the Grand Hotel at Charing Cross is sadly no longer there. Say demolished in '68 for the building of the M8. And the Grand really was one of Glasgow's top hotels. The strange thing is, it sort of lost its popularity with the coming of the railways. When the new railway hotels were built, the St Enoch, the Central, and technically the North British at Queen Street is actually a much older building that was converted into a hotel. The St Enoch Hotel in St Enoch Square and the Central Hotel. And it's the usual, I mean, being back to the early 1970s, the cool hotel to be at was the Albany in Glasgow. And then come the early 80s, yeah, it's been outbuilt by the Hilton with bigger, fancier bedrooms and bigger function suites. So hotels almost always have a bit of a shelf life.
Moran says, can you suggest any resources for imagery of a street named Pentland Place? When we visited Glasgow in the 90s, it was just a parking lot. We're interested because it was our father's childhood home. That's when we want to research later.
The best one I can always recommend is the Mitchell Library's virtual Mitchell site, where you can go in and search by street, by A to Z. And if they don't have it, I'm not sure where best to suggest. But the virtual Mitchell site is very useful.
Yeah. Joanne Sanderson says, thanks so much, Norry, excellent talk. One of the corona upsides is I'm able to join from Norway, when I wouldn't have managed otherwise. It's the nearest I'll get to Glasgow for a while. I'm originally from East Kilbride, so know the Dolan Baths well. Here's one that you could talk all night on. Jodie McGarry says, Norry, what's your favourite Glasgow fact? Stand by.
Oh God, that's a strange one. What would I say is my favourite Glasgow fact? The fact that if you walk up the high street, just below the cathedral, where there's part of still the old wall of Duke Street prison, you can still make out bullet pock marks on the wall from an IRA prison bust in the 1920s. I kind of like that, because it's one of these stories that virtually nobody knows anything about.
Katrina Caldwell says, asking for the third time, were there any other famous women who visited Glasgow back in the day? Thanks.
Well, we'd practically every famous female show business star, right from the very early days of music hall, Vesta Tilley and all the rest of them. I'm not sure whether, I think Sarah Bernhardt did make it to Glasgow. We certainly had, and I'm trying to remember the famous opera singer known as the Swedish Nightingale, whose name will come back to me, who stayed in a hotel in, I was at the Salt Market, or somewhere just about there. I'm trying to remember her name. There's actually a corner somewhere in Ayrshire that is named after her. And that's, I can't remember her name, the Swedish Nightingale. No, that's going to come back to me at the moment. It did tend to be, I mean, we had Marlene Dietrich at the Alhambra. Whether anyone came up and saw her that night, we'll never know. I think, or was that Mae West? We had Mae West as well. Yeah, huge numbers of female stars of stage and screen in Glasgow. Various female politicos as well, but very much by the sort of nature of the times. Usually women up until at least the 1950s, 1960s were still defined by their husbands or their husband's role. So it tends to be, famous man comes to city with wife.
Just looking up Google, Joanna Maria Jenny Lind was a Swedish opera singer.
Jenny Lind.
There you go.
Jenny Lind.
Elizabeth McDade says, terrific talk, thank you. My dad was born in Glasgow in 1938. He told stories about walking past POW camps. He grew up in Bridgeton and Pentland Place. Do you have any info about the POW camps? Thanks, I really enjoyed this.
Now, I'm not sure about ones out in Bridgeton. I mean, I'm born, bred and buttered in Cardonald. And there were certainly POW camps out the back of Pollock, with both Italian and German prisoners in them. There's fabulous photographs of the building of the early stages of the Pollock housing scheme, which had been started just before the Second World War, but most of the infrastructure, the plumbing and sewage was actually laid in by Italian and German prisoners of war who were put out in day release from the prison of war camps to do the work. And there's a spectacular picture of the then Clerk of Works of Glasgow in his three-piece suit and his bowler hat, standing over a trench of German soldiers still in their Wehrmacht uniforms, digging the holes for the sewage pipes in Pollock.
Fiona Reid says, Norry, my dad went to see Roy Rogers and Trigger in 1953. Would that have been at the Empire? He can't remember. He was only 3.
Yep, that was the Glasgow Empire. It was also famously the time Roy Rogers took Trigger into the Central Hotel, and Trigger climbed up the central staircase, and they put straw on the floor of the bridal suite at the Central Hotel, and the idea was that Trigger was staying the night in the bridal suite. What they actually did was they took Trigger up, they got a few press photos, and then as soon as the press had gone, Trigger was sent back down the stairs in one of the big service lifts and spent the night out at the police stables.
Maureen says, Frankie Vaughan came to Glasgow many times, especially the night she was born, February 3rd, 1968, which was his 40th birthday. He was also involved in Easter House for the gangs, wasn't he?
Yes, trying to get the gangs to stop fighting, and there's various hilarious stories about the response that Frankie Vaughan got up there, and the various bits of graffiti about Frankie Vaughan can get to, we're no giving our chibs up and all the rest of it. But there's also, if you go online, there's fabulous footage of him speaking with the gangs. And Frankie Vaughan, even though he was a big stage star, Frankie Vaughan had come from the wrong sides of the tracks in the East End of London. He knew what life was like in the hard end of it, and he knew that the only way that folk get out of that, I mean, they used to say boxing or football was the only way for kids to get out of poverty. Frankie knew that show business or rock and roll, that was another way out. But you never get out by fighting your neighbours. You never get out by punching down. You got to punch up if you want to make your way out.
Margaret says, Jack House was known as Mr. Glasgow, as his knowledge of the city was legendary. Surely that title will now be yours. More lost, I think, than Mr. Glasgow.
I wish, I must admit, I still go back and refer to Jack House's numerous books, because obviously he had first-hand experience of things that I only know from books. But no, Jack House and his journalism were absolutely fabulous. And as I say, I still use various old Jack House books to reference things and look up stories and check dates and check names.
Jade Wallace says, hi Norry, great talk. Thank you so much for all your knowledge. I'm wondering if you know any comments that Einstein said about Glasgow University teaching at that time.
Not off the top of my head, although if you go to if you just type in Glasgow University, Einstein, I'm pretty sure there's an entire web article about Einstein's visit to Glasgow, including comments from folk who heard his his speech about general relativity. And I know there was, as you can imagine, it was the hottest ticket in Glasgow to try and get into the Butte Hall to hear Einstein speak when he accepted his honorary doctorate. And there's a great picture of him walking across the quads with the wind catching his gown, just about blowing him over. And he's doing a great big smile to camera. But as I say, I'm sure there's a Glasgow University story on the Glasgow University website with first-hand comments from folk that were there that day who heard and saw him speak.
Okay, Adam Marshall says, do you know of any other repurposed artefacts like the Central Hotel doors at Cafe Gandolfi?
Not really off the top of my head. You find there's odd wee bits of architectural stuff. Oh, in fact, I do one that I noticed just the other week. Most of you will remember the old underground public kludges at St Vincent Place, just at the top, at the corner of Buchanan Street. And admittedly, the underground ones have been closed for years, but the above ground toilets that are there now are surrounded by wonderful architectural ironwork. And it was only a couple of months ago that I was passing. I took a closer look at it, and it all bears the crest of the Glasgow Caledonian Railway. And it turns out that the ornamental ironwork around the modern kludges was rescued from the old Glasgow Cross station, which used to sit just below the toll booth, and has been repurposed to enclose today's modern kludges. So there's some nice Victorian ironwork, probably from the Saracen foundry up in Possil, has found its way back into the city centre and getting a second life.
Brian McKay says the bullets at Duke Street Prison are mentioned in the book Irish by John Burroughs. And Eleanor says the Arian Spears Bridge is named after Jenny Lind. And Tom says, great presentation, Norry, but this chat afterwards is just as interesting. Thank you. And that's the end of dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of messages, so well done.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for your questions and your time and your patience and your forbearance. And thank you, Bill, for being my quizmaster.
No problem.
And hopefully when this all lifts, we'll get that pint together again.
The one that you're buying.
Oh, aye.
Good stuff.
Okie doke.
All the best.
Right, we shall call that a night. Thanks again, folks.